Well, hello, everyone. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. You are here watching the Fortuna series on everything you need to know about the MBA, but may have been afraid to ask. Today, we're going to talk about the five most common MBA interview questions and how to best answer them. We have with us one of Fortuna's Dream Team members. Fortuna has assembled a group of former insiders at the top business schools who now are working on the outside on your behalf. And today we have Rachel Erickson He, who is a Stanford GSB alumnus and the former GSB MBA interviewer. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
So obviously you've had a lot of experience interviewing MBA candidates at Stanford. Given your experience, what do you think are the five questions that MBA candidates are most frequently asked?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to just say is these are not the five most frequently asked questions for Stanford. Different schools have very different approaches to what questions they ask. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the questions that Stanford asks, but this is really kind of a general overview for all of the schools of what they might be. The first question, which is one that actually often is not asked at Stanford, is tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. That is a pretty common question that a lot of interviewers will ask.
Now,
And
when someone asks the question, walk me through your resume, you can either do something that's very redundant and just simply say what the resume says, or you can give your position and then explain in a little more conversational detail what you actually did that may not be on your resume. And I'm assuming that the latter is the way to answer the question. Am I right?
yes, absolutely. And in fact, this is a really tough question. First of all, because so many people have prepared for it, which means it's pretty hard to sound canned. And then also you have
Mm.
the fact that it's basically a monologue, which is not a great way to start an interview. But there's really no choice when you're faced with this question. So what I tell people to do is focus on the highlights. Don't feel like you need to cover everything. Just give the important things and focus only on the stuff that's not on your paper, on the reasons why, and on making it personal. So let's say your job is in renewable energy. You could not talk about the job necessarily. They know you're taking, you have that job, but say, I grew up in Utah, for example, and I loved being outdoors, hiking and snowshoeing. That led to my interest in the environment. And I studied sustainable energy in college. And that's how I found this job at my sustainable energy firm. So that you're giving them more of a sense of the person kind of behind the paper. That's the way I think that helps make that question a little bit more relatable and a little bit more engaging for the interviewer.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Now, let's say you have five different jobs on your resume. Instead of just going through each one of them as if it's going through a catalog item, would it be better or allowable to say, of all the jobs I've had, the most formative experience for me has been blank, and here's why.
Absolutely, 100%. If it was a job at Goldman Sachs and you were an analyst and you did what every other analyst did, don't waste time on that. You might want to explain why you were interested in finance, and then you could just say, I took the job at Goldman, and then I had the and literally that's it about Goldman. I had the opportunity to move to X, which was what I was really interested about, and this is what I learned there that I felt was, important and that is, related to something else.
And what I like already about this, Rachel, is that you are answering these questions in a very conversational, colloquial way. You do not feel scripted or rehearsed, and that is one of the problems with interviews and interviewers, right? If you come off as overly scripted, that's a problem.
That's a huge problem. And I think a lot of interviewers actually will deliberately try to knock someone off the script if they are stuck on it. And I know when I was interviewing people, that is something I would do. I would immediately, if they started going on, first of all, because I genuinely had questions and wanted to answer, but also because I wanted to probe, I would start asking them questions. So that's something else to be prepared for, that, take a breath every minute or two. Let the interviewer see if the interviewer has a question to jump in that they want to ask you about that job. Maybe they do want to understand something better and give them that opportunity. Yes.
Okay, let's get to the other four questions that are most commonly asked after Walk me through your resume or tell me about yourself.
Sure. I'd say the second question, which is really asked at a ton of business schools, is either why do you want an MBA or why are you interested in this school? That is a very, very, very frequent question.
How do you answer that?
Sure. Okay. So first thing you need to know is that if you have not, at some earlier point in the interview, told the interviewer what your career vision is, you have to start with your career vision because your reasons for going to business school don't make any sense if you haven't explained what you're going to do with that MBA after you graduate. So keep that in mind. Even if they're not explicitly asking it, they are implicitly asking that. So that's the first piece of advice that I would give.
You can't say, because I want to make more money, and your school is ranked higher than the other schools I've applied to.
Yeah, yeah. One other piece of advice I'm just going to give is the other thing never to mention is the network and the connections. You know, business schools are schools. They teach, they believe that their education is really, really valuable, and they want people who are there to learn. And if you're like, oh, yeah, I'm there for the network, I want to schmooze, like that is a red flag. So those are a couple things not to do. But there are a couple of things that I would say are important in answering this question. And it's a mistake that I see a lot, but people think that they need to show off how much they know about the school.
Right.
And what you really want to do is help the interviewer get to know more about you. They do not care about the courses at the school. They're either at the school or they've graduated and they know them. What they want to do is learn more about you. So, for example, if you're taking you want to take negotiations, you don't want to say, oh, I'm really interested in negotiations because I want to learn conflict resolution management. They know that. What you could do instead is you could say, well, since I'm interested in working in the government, I'm going to be working with stakeholders that are everything from elected officials to special interest groups to other government agencies. And getting all of these people with competing interests to work together is going to be really, really hard. And so I'm going to need some spectacular negotiation skills in order to get all of those people to align. And that's your reason for going to business school, but it's that you're also giving them a little bit more information about what it is that you want to do and why you want to do it.
Yeah, I like the spin you're putting on these answers. I really do, because they're adding another dimension to the candidate's profile above and beyond just simply answering the question, which makes therefore the answer to be mo so much more valuable. Okay, what are the other three questions that we're going to focus on?
Sure. The other question, and this is one where if you are at a Stanford interview, you will see a lot of these questions, is behavioral questions. And
Mm,
behavioral questions very often start with, tell me about a time when. And it's, tell me about a time when you had to work with a difficult person. Tell me about a time when you had an impact on your team's project. Tell me about a time when you were in a particularly challenging situation and had to come up with a solution. And all of the schools are going to ask these questions. Some of the schools like Harvard and MIT that have your full application and ask very specific pointed questions, they may not ask that type of question. They may not start with tell me about a time when, but they will say, for example, oh, you mentioned in your application that there were no standardized processes in place at your company. And so how did you solve that problem? And that is also a behavioral question. It's important to know that. And the reason why almost all the schools ask these behavioral questions is because they're very, very important in terms of getting at what the business schools are looking for. And I'll just kind of go through some of the main characteristics that they need, that they are seeking. So the first is, can you meet challenges? Do you show initiative? And what is the impact that you've had on an organization? They want to see those traits. The next is your intellectual ability. So can you analyze? Can you synthesize information? Do you come up with new ideas? How creative are you? All of that set of characteristics. And then the third one is your interpersonal skills. How effective are you at influencing a situation? How well do you work with other people? And are you someone who helps other people grow and develop and brings out the best in them? And when you look at those sort of three general areas, those are really the way that pretty much all of the business schools define leadership. So when they ask these questions, what they're looking for is, do you have evidence that you have demonstrated some of these leadership characteristics that they're looking for? Not nobody's going to have every single one of them in the course of their career, but they should be able to get a sense of some things that you've done that demonstrate that leadership ability. So that's
Yeah,
basically the reason why they're asking those questions.
that's great advice. And obviously, under that rubric, behavioral questions, there can be a whole portfolio of queries that someone might be asked. So I wonder, are there two other questions that roll out the five, or basically the behavioral category accounts for the rest of them?
No, the behavioral questions are some for some interviews a big chunk of them, but then sometimes you might get a question that's a little bit more general, like what is the role you typically play in a team, or what is your
Uh,
leadership style? Behavioral questions are very specifically about a particular example and a particular situation, and those are a little bit more general. But once again, kind of back to the way I talked about how you answer your resume and how you answer the why MBA question, you want to keep it specific and you want to keep it personal. And you want it really to be about your leadership style. So people sometimes think, oh my God, I got to prove that I'm a great leader. And it's like, no, they don't care. They're not asking you to rank yourself as a leader. They're asking you to just describe the way that you show up and what you do. So you could be somebody maybe who's not particularly emotive. You're really rational, you're really analytical, but you're really good with facts and numbers. And then you could talk about how that's how you lead, is by providing evidence to your boss that makes them absolutely 100% on board with whatever it is that decision needs to be made. So it's just about also trying to make sure that the style and who you come across as, if you're answering that question, is also consistent with the person that's going to show up in the rest of your application. So if your recommenders describe you one way and you answer that question with something completely different, there's going to be a disconnect. So you do want to think about really who you are and trying to portray that accurately, because they're going to get that from other parts of the application anyway, and make sure that it all makes sense as a whole.
how do you answer that question and not come off as someone who's bragging?
So that's, once again, it's not about, oh, I'm a great leader. I do this, I do this, I do this. It's think about specific stories you can tell that illustrate your leadership style. That's a really great way. The whole adage of show, don't tell. Well, if you give an example, that speaks for you. So I think that's the best way to do it. And then once again, back to, it's not about being a great leader. It's just like, it's sort of asking, who are you as a person?
Hmm,
But who are you as a person and a leader? Because everybody's different and everybody's unique, and it's just communicating that.
right. Okay, do you have a fifth most common MBA interview question?
Yes, and this is another one that gets asked at a lot of schools, and it's kind of a fun question. It's at the end of the interview very often, where they'll ask, well, how is it that you plan to contribute to our community? Or, what is something that you're really excited about?
Mhm.
And this is your chance to, relax, enjoy it, but still remember that it's an interview and you want to show who you are as a person, even with this question. So for example, if you're talking to Columbia, you could say, well, I'm a huge foodie and I am so excited to move to New York because I have this list of 15 restaurants that I am dying to try. And maybe that will spark a conversation with your interviewer where you go into which ones they've gone to, and that can be really fun. Or maybe you're that person from Utah and you are super excited to go to Tuck because you can't wait to explore all of the outdoor activities and take up snowshoeing again. And so you can have a conversation about that. And then, also in terms of how you're going to contribute to the community, it's, once again, keep it personal, but help to share a little bit about what you've done in the past. So I had one client and they were an amateur photographer, and they talked about how one of their goals was to take photographs throughout the course of their 2 years at business school to really provide a record for their class. And I thought that was just a great way for him to show who he was as a person and also show what he was going to bring to that business school.
Yeah, I love that example. Now, Rachel, I wonder if all schools pretty much conduct the interview the same way, or are there significant differences among the different schools?
No, so that's a great question, and I'll just kind of quickly take you through the main styles. Harvard and MIT, for example, it's an admissions committee member who's interviewing you, and they have read your entire application. So a lot of times the questions are very specific, very pointed. it is really hard to predict some of those questions. A lot of them come out of left field. So if you're prepping for that sort of interview, you're not going to be able to nail, oh, here are the 5 common questions that I'm likely to be asked. But what you can do is you can practice just being ready to answer things spontaneously and go with the flow of the interview and keeping your answers concise. That's sort of one of the pieces of advice we give for those types of interviews. And then most of the other schools, it's either alumni or second-year students who conduct the interview. But even there's a really big range. So Stanford, which is very behaviorally focused, Kellogg, Booth, Columbia Business School are a couple schools where there's a balance. So they'll ask you about your personal interests. They'll ask you why you're interested in the community. But they will also throw in some behavioral questions. And then the European schools do some really interesting things. London Business School basically makes you prepare a mini presentation. They ask you a question on a subject which you're not necessarily an expert on. They give you 5 minutes to write, and then they give you 5 minutes to present it to them, which is, can be really challenging and nerve-wracking.
Wow.
Yeah. And then INSEAD, they have 2 alumni interviews. So which I think is a great idea. It helps reduce the bias, but obviously it's a big commitment on the part of the alumni.
And the time element is also different, right? Oftentimes, alumni interviews feel less structured and can go on for well over an hour. In the case of a Harvard interview, it's a strict 30-minute shot you have. I don't know what it is at Stanford. Is it 30 minutes as well, I would assume?
No, the Stanford interview is usually a minimum of 45 minutes, with 30 minutes of them asking you questions and then maybe 15 minutes of you asking them questions at the end. But then if the interviewer goes over, I was bad about that. And we get really interested in what the person was saying, spend an hour talking with them about their experience. So yeah, prepare for any interview that you're doing with an alumni. 30 minutes to an hour and 30 minutes, just block that time out so that you have room on either side.
Now, I'm going to ask you the most oddball or trick question you ever asked an applicant when you were interviewing them at Stanford. But before that, I want to point out some of the oddball questions that people have been asked at Harvard. We know this because Harvard MBAs have actually shared them, and they're kind of like shocking. And I'm thinking that these questions are, anomalies, because what you've described is how I think a real professional, good admissions interview should go. But things like, how would your parents describe you when you were 12? Or explain the C on your transcript on that economics class you took at undergrad. Or, what company do you follow that isn't Google or Apple? Or what would be your dream job and why? Or what's the one thing you'll never be good at as others? Those are kind of like a little off the wall questions that Harvard applicants have been asked. What's the most trickiest question you've ever asked?
So with the Stanford interview, the tricky questions are not the upfront questions. Those are going to be softballs. You can Google them on the internet and you'll find a lot of them out there. The tricky questions are in the follow-on questions
Ah,
because they're going to stop you and they're going to say, no, wait, what did your boss say? How did you do that? What did that person, how did you manage that? They are going to like drill way deep. You're going to be like, oh God, what did that person ask me? Or how did I handle that? And that's where you're going to get the sort of, I'd say, trickier questions at Stanford. They're not going to be these necessarily, I never at least asked those kind of off the wall, sort of tell me about what you were like when you were 12 questions, but I would, and I would ask a lot of questions. I mean, sometimes I'd be like, oh, so what do you think is going to happen at your company with blah, 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 da, 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 da. But they were always usually focused on what the applicant was talking about, but at a level that they might not have expected to go to in terms of the detail and the granularity.
right. So expect to be interviewed by a journalist in essence, who's drilling down and not accepting the base answer or the answer that feels a little too scripted or
No.
rehearsed. Then, your job really as a journalist is to get you totally off script and it's to do
Yep.
whatever it takes to get there. And I'm assuming that's pretty similar with an admissions interviewer.
Yeah, well, for Stanford at least, I would say 100%. And look, the good news is as an applicant, you don't have to worry. You don't have to memorize anything. You just, really know your work experience, know what you've done, know what examples you might be able to talk about, and then just be in the moment, answer the questions, and go with the flow, which I think is the best advice for all interviews.
Indeed. But there's so much is at stake. It's hard not to go in there anxiety ridden because if you've already made it past that first key hurdle and you're going in to be interviewed, your chances are pretty good at getting in, but you don't want to blow it. So, I imagine there's quite a bit of nerve-wracking going on when you walk through that door or you get on that Zoom and you have to be interviewed, right? I mean, how do you calm your nerves?
Oh, so that's a great point because I'm just going to say that I interviewed a lot of people, and at the very beginning of the interview, I could actually hear their voices shaking. That
Yeah.
was not uncommon, and it's fine. I didn't care. I knew they were nervous. I knew it was a stressful situation. And within a couple of minutes of getting into the interview and starting to talk, they all calmed down, their voices returned to normal, and I was able to see what they were about. And I think that's something else to keep in mind in all these interviews is they know you're nervous. They're they're there to give you a chance. They want you to show the best of yourself. They're not looking for, oh, there's a gotcha. They didn't get that answer exactly right. They're looking for the overall picture. So it's okay to be nervous. It's even okay to show that you're a little bit nervous, just as long as what you're saying is actually something that's really showing the best of who you are.
Yeah. Now, Rachel, before I let you go, I got to ask you this. Your single most memorable experience in an interview at Stanford when you were interviewing candidates, um, maybe even asking not only what's most memorable, but the one that was the worst interview ever.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I only had one like this. Yeah, first of all, I'm going to say most of the people I interviewed, like the reason they got the interview is they're very good. They're really qualified.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, it's not about like this person did better in the interview. It's really about just giving more context. And I think that's true for all these interviews. Because generally everybody does well. One person who did not asked me, a very awkward question about a professor that they knew that it's sort of like they wanted me to talk to about them. And I was like, that's not appropriate. It was an ask that, I mean, your interviewer interviews you, and that is the only contact we are supposed to have with them. And they sounded like they were sort of trying to emphasize their connections in a way that made me uncomfortable. So that was the one time I've had sort of a really negative experience with an interview.
That's really interesting because it just goes to show you're there to be interviewed. You're not there to do anything that's overtly an attempt to advance your chances of admission. And maybe that person thought, okay, if I let them know I know this professor, so should give me a leg up. That actually doesn't give you a leg up; it gives you a leg down.
Yeah.
Because it just feels too promotional,
Yeah. It was,
right? Yeah. So just be yourself, try to relax yourself, go in there and just answer the questions in the most conversational way possible. And it is important to practice, right? Because you need to practice, but you can't get to that point where you're so scripted.
yeah. So I think the best thing is, once again, it's about practicing the format. It's about practicing the style. Fortuna, we do mock interviews for all of these schools, and that can be a fantastic experience. It's not about getting the questions necessarily. I mean, you might get some of these, but it's really more about getting comfortable with and understanding the way to handle yourself in an interview. And that's really sort of the best thing to do when you're practicing.
Rachel, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure that everyone who is interviewed by you came away thinking it was a positive experience.
I certainly hope so. I have a great time doing it.
So, if someone would like to get in touch with you or one of your colleagues at Fortuna, how should they connect?
They should go to the Fortuna website, which Fortuna Admissions is the company name. And the best way to connect is actually you can ask for a free 30-minute consultation, which is where one of our fantastic team members will give the information, an assessment, to talk with you about your profile, what you're looking for. And then if you're interested, you could potentially be connected with a coach.
Great. You could also ping Fortuna at info@fortunaadmissions.com. And as Rachel mentioned, Fortuna does mock interviews to help you prepare for this big event in your journey to a top business school. So that's another option if you were already applied and now you got your shot, but you need some professional advice on how to proceed and move into that next phase with a lot of self-confidence, but not cockiness. Fortuna can help you there. All right, you've been watching Rachel talk about the 5 most common MBA interview questions and how to answer them. Rachel, thank you for being with us today and for sharing your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for all of you out there, watch out for our other episodes in this Fortuna series on everything you need to know about the MBA, but may have been afraid to ask. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Thanks for watching.